Alright, it's story time. Something a little different for you today. You know, I love to tell stories. And I don't think it's a coincidence that every October the National Storytelling Festival takes place in Jonesboro, Tennessee, which is a town in the county next to the county I was raised in, up in the northeast corner of Tennessee. I went there a couple of times during high school and I really enjoyed it. You know, if you think about it, storytelling is a very important thing for those of us who are descended from the northern European tribes, the barbarians, as the Romans called them. Because if you think about it, a lot of our myths, legends, stories, and sagas, they were passed down through the spoken word. Of course, I'm aware of the runes and that they were used sometimes, among other things, to tell stories, to convey messages, such as the various stones that the Norse carved in various parts of Northern Europe and elsewhere. But you know, that took a lot of effort. It wasn't like it was in Southern Europe where they had the written word. They may have used papyrus or some other medium to record their messages on. So the spoken word was how knowledge was usually transmitted. Storytelling is also very important in Appalachian culture, because if you think about it, back in, say, the 19th, 20th century, first half of the 20th century, a not insignificant proportion of the population in the rural extremes of Appalachia, some of the people were illiterate. They'd never went to school, never really had much of a formal education. Illiteracy was a bit of a problem in some cases. So, the stories were told through the spoken word. That video clip at the beginning of this video, that is my great-grandfather's old farm back home. My great-aunt still lives there to this day. Whenever I go back home, every few months, I always go up there to visit and usually try to make a video to show you how it is up there in the holler, at the top of the holler. And what I got for you today is a story from Japan back in 1946. My great-grandfather, his name was Scott. He was born in 1915. He was the third of 5 brothers, and he was born and raised just a couple of miles down the holler from that video clip that I showed you. You know, I was very, very close to him as a child. Closer to him than I was my own grandfather, his son, to a degree. He passed away, he died of pancreatic cancer when he was 81. He died on July the 4th, 1996. As I said, I was very close to him. I remember going to the funeral, and I cried. That was the first death that really hit me, I guess you could say. 5 years earlier, his wife, the matriarch of that side of our family, she passed away. And I remember it, but I was only 4 years old. I didn't really have an understanding of what death is. So it hit me hard when he passed away. You know, they don't make men, well, I'm not going to say that per se. There are cases. But it seems like by and large, they don't make men today like they did back then. My great-grandfather was a farmer, and I remember as a child, he had arms, forearms, wrists that were as thick as 4x4s. I mean, he had massive forearms. Up until his 70s, he worked on the farm, gardening, raising his livestock, building and repairing fencing. I mean, I try to work out my forearms. I'm big on the forearm curls and everything, but mine are not the same as his. He was truly country strong. My great aunt told me a story several years ago about the only time he ever went to jail for any offense. It was back in the 1960s, early 60s. My grandfather that I mentioned earlier, his son, was in high school. He had gotten into a fight during class, and he ended up being suspended. While the other two boys he fought against, who started it, didn't face such a punishment. This pissed my great-grandfather off, and the next day, my grandfather, of course, was suspended. He had to stay home, work around the farm. But when it came time to get he would always pick my great aunt up from school. Loaded up in this truck, drove down to the school to pick her up when school let out. But he wanted to have a word with the high school principal, the headmaster. And apparently, out in front of the high school there, back home, their words got rather heated. And my aunt told me that my great-grandfather knocked the headmaster out cold. One blow, one strike, knocked him out cold, and he left him laying on the sidewalk in front of the front doors of the high school. He told my aunt that they'd better get going, and they went back home up to the farm. A few hours later, of course, the county sheriff's department rolls up. They arrest my great-grandfather, and he had to spend the night in jail. Probably had to pay a fine, maybe go to court, but you know, I truly admire that. That's one of the things that I am most disgusted by our people today here in America, is that we have totally, by and large, outsourced conflict resolution to the state. People call the police and the law for the most trivial of disagreements sometimes. The most, really just over anything. And that's one of our huge problems, I believe. You know, I have a sort of admiration for the ancient practice of dueling. Maybe I'll make a video about that one day, but we have totally outsourced conflict resolution, and I'm disgusted by it. I am an advocate, an absolutist for the concept of white omerta. I do not like the police, never have, never will. But anyways, you know, they don't, as I was trying to illustrate, they don't seem to make them like that anymore. Now, the story I have for you. My great-grandfather, in 1942, was sent off to the Pacific Theater of World War II. I don't know many details at all about his time island hopping overseas in the Southern Pacific. He never talked about it to any of us. Very seldom. And this particular story he told my father back when he was alive. I do know this. He was discharged, honorably discharged in 1946 as a private first class in the Army. And he's seen violence and he's seen combat. I do know that he fought in the Philippines for a period of time. And following the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he was a part of the occupational force that was there to occupy Japan. He had been given the option to continue his service in the Army in late 1945, but he declined because he was ready to get back home up in the holler to his wife and to buy a farm. He'd had enough of it. Now, I don't know which particular island or part of Japan he was stationed at those last 6 months or so. I don't know a lot about the geography of Japan, or much about Japan at all, to tell you the truth. But I do know that it was in a rural area of Japan. He was a guard at an outpost. He would sit there with a couple of other guys and watch one of the gates that led into the complex. And there was lots of farmland around their little base, I guess you could call it. Lots of farmland. And in the last month or so that he was stationed there, counting down the days that he would be able to get back on a boat and come here to America to get back home to his young wife, he got to observing this Japanese man who was probably in his 40s. He was a farmer, and it was in the late winter, early spring of 1946. This Japanese man was out there working the soil, sowing his vegetables. And over a period of about 2 to 3 weeks, my grandfather, in the boring, sort of tedious job of guarding the outpost, really got to paying attention to the methods and the techniques and to what crops that this man was trying to plant, this Japanese man. It was a few days before he was set to leave. He had been on duty from the early morning up until lunchtime. And on this particular day, he decided that he was going to go out there and try to speak to this Japanese man. Which he knew he was Japanese, of course. He knew very little Japanese, maybe just a word or two of their language. But he thought, as a kind gesture, that particular day, when he was relieved of his post, he went to the mess hall and he got his usual roast beef and gravy sandwich. I guess you'd call it an open-faced roast beef sandwich. He ate his dinner, his lunch, but he also got a paper bag and he wrapped up a couple of the open-faced roast beef sandwiches and got a couple of apples as well. He put it into the paper bag and he decided he was going to go out there and speak to this farmer who he had grown to admire because it gave him something to watch. And also, as I'd mentioned, my great-grandfather was a farmer, first and foremost. So he walked out, left one of the gates, and the man was working. It was probably about 2 o'clock. It was after lunchtime. He had to walk about 100 yards across the field. And as he approached this Japanese man, he noticed my grandfather approaching, put down his hoe, and walked over to him with a smile on his face. And my great-grandfather motioned to him with the paper bag, pointed at it, was like, "You want a sandwich, you know?" And the Japanese man, the farmer, to his utter disbelief and surprise, walked up to him and said, "Well, thank you kindly, sir," in perfect English. This actually surprised my great-grandfather quite a bit. How is this Japanese farmer speaking English? And they managed to have a conversation for about 30 minutes. It turned out that this Japanese farmer was from this region, this area of Japan, and that this land had been in his family for a few generations. It was actually his uncle's land, and that this Japanese man had lived in San Diego, California for about half of his life. When he was in his early 20s, he left Japan to come to America, lived in San Diego. And what had happened was that this man, who was in his 40s, he had decided to come back and see some of his family, his uncles, a couple of his brothers. In early December of 1941, actually late November, I should say, he said he had been there for a few weeks when Pearl Harbor had occurred. And once that happened, he had no way to get back to America. So he had just been here helping his family. He had had some nephews who had been in the Japanese, I guess, Imperial Army, who had fought against the Americans. One of them had been killed. He said he was rather worried too when he first came there and when Pearl Harbor happened, thinking that he might be aggravated or even persecuted. He said that some government officials had came to talk to him and, well, basically left him alone, realized he was not engaged in any sort of espionage. But that absolutely surprised and astounded my great-grandfather. He had expected to be able to not be able to communicate at all with this Japanese man, this farmer that he had grown to admire over those last couple of months that he was in Japan. But anyways, that's my story for you. Just something a little different. I like to tell stories, like I said. And I thought this is one that always interested me when my dad told me about it several years back. But anyways, what I would advise is learn how to tell stories. Keep people's attention. It's a trait that all of our European ancestors, especially those of the barbaric tribes, but also those of the Greek, Roman, and Latin countries in Southern Europe. It's a great thing to tell stories. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.